We're talking today to Jeremy Moulton and Clement Moissard from the Departments of Politics and Physics, respectively, here at the University of York. Lucy is joining us shortly. As you might detect, this is a tacked-on intro, recorded in haste, post-fact, because we had a few audio issues in the podcast itself. So it gives me a chance to give a brief intro to the conversation itself. We talked to Jeremy and Clement today about, really the idea was that they were going to talk about their own scholarly projects, but we ended up talking more about how they use ideas from the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning in their own teaching, which was equally interesting and just fascinating to hear two different disciplines sit next to each other and discuss teaching and learning and how these ways differ. So hopefully there'll be another chance for them to pop back into the podcast to talk more about their projects in more detail. But it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. And without further delay, I bring you Clement Moissard and Jeremy Moulton.
So I'm Clement Moissard, and I've been in the physics department for about a year and a half, a bit less than that yet. Before that, I was interested in teaching. Like in my graduate studies, for example, I would always spend way more time preparing for courses than doing research, which I think led me where I am. And a few years ago, already 4 years ago, time flies, I wrote a book about how to study physics for students. And it was, the first idea was to write a PDF essentially to help out students that I was tutoring. And then it just grew and grew. And in the end, I just published it on my own through a self-publishing program, Amazon self-publishing program. And so now that I'm a physics teacher, I'm trying to figure out how to try and help students get better at physics and enjoy it as much as I do.
Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks. I'm Jeremy Moulton. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Politics, and I've been with the department for 5 years now, I think. And yeah, it's really lovely to be here and lovely to have this initiative going on because I'm very keen on this scholarship of teaching and learning practice and advancing what we do at York.
Clement, just a quick question about that. I mean, you wrote physics book for what age group aimed at? So you mentioned kids, is it?
Yeah, well, I say kids. It was aimed at first-year university students.
Okay.
I think could be read by high school students. I know some high school students have read it.
That's fantastic. Are you applying it now in what you're doing?
Just to some extent, yeah.
Yeah.
To some extent. I mean, do you want me to talk more about what I wrote about?
Well, yeah, for sure. But I mean, and one thing that I was wondering if the learning process of these different disciplines is different in itself. So if we're talking about the scholarship of teaching and learning for physics as compared to a more qualitative discipline, are people learning things in a different way? Because we had this paper we were looking at the other day where they talked about physics as being, what was the phrase, vertical knowledge?
Hard, pure.
Hard, pure, things stacked on top of each other.
Terminology.
As opposed to a sort of broad landscape of qualitative ideas. What was your thesis in the book?
Since I don't know of other topics, it's going to be hard to say that physics is different, right? But what I find when I talk to people, or when I hear people talk about science, is that generally they think it's a bit more rigorous than it is, or more structured than it is. But in any case, the main structure of the book, the main thesis was that when you think about physics, you have to do it in 4 steps, essentially, which is the first one, imagine really well, visualize what you're thinking about, what you want to talk about. Then write down everything you know about it, so equations that may describe it, initial conditions, that sort of things. And then do the calculations, and once you've done this, wonder, is that right? What does it teach me? Or another question you can ask yourself is, so what? And so if you replace and do the calculation by develop an argument, I feel like that method of thinking can actually apply to many, many different things, right? Mm. And funnily enough, actually, one of the feedback I had on my book was, I think last year, someone contacted me to say, I bought that book for my son and he doesn't like following methods, so he ignored it, but I've read it. So that was the mum of the kid. And she said, since then, I've applied this 4 steps method to my career and I've got a promotion. And that's thanks to the idea. And that was a completely different area of application that I never thought about.
That's such lovely feedback.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah.
When you were writing the book, what ideas kind of underpinned? How much of it was based on literature that you'd read about how people learn, and how much of it was just from experience?
It was mostly from experience. So this 4-step thing is from another book that was written a while ago by a mathematician called How to Solve It. And the idea was that mathematician just talked to a bunch of experts and say, okay, I want to figure out what's the difference in thinking between experts and non-experts. And he came up with a 4 steps process that looked a lot like what I've just described. Then I just explained it in a way that would make sense to a physics student. So that, I think, is the central idea. But then I just read about, methods for studying, but that was based on books or based on the internet and based on experience. So, for example, you want to use a recall over recognition. So, for example, trying to write down what you remember and then compare it to your notes is much more beneficial for your learning than answering a quiz would be, for example. So that's sort of small methods that I picked up.
When was the point at which you decided you were going to write a book? And kind of what were the questions? What was the process that happened before then? Because we're sort of starting often at the level of something's happening in my classroom, what's happening or what's not happening. What were the steps there? And then maybe, Jeremy, we could bring you in as well about sort of what questions do you have about the teaching that happens in your context and whether and how they compare?
It was during my PhD, and I was tutoring a lot of different students, and I just kept hearing myself say the same thing again and again and again. So I thought maybe I should just compile it and see where it leads. And the process of doing that actually led me to reading more and learning more about it all, which was quite fun. And I also remember that discussion with my PhD advisors. I asked them, hey, I have this idea, I'd like to write a book. Can I get some of my teaching load replaced by this? And they say, no, during your PhD, you don't have time. You should do that later when you're done. And I thought to myself, well, that's funny. I've heard these exact words since I'm in high school. Like, you've got this exam coming up soon, so you need to focus on that and don't do anything else. And I thought, okay, well, best time is now. So that was the process, really.
So it was noticing what was happening with students or what wasn't happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeremy, does that chime with anything when you thought about how best to create the optimal conditions for learning in a politics environment? So take it doesn't have the same, you don't have this situation where you've got to say, right, you need to learn this before you can learn this, and then you can, in physics it's not quite so linear. But is any of that transferable?
It's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, because the new subject benchmark statement for politics and international relations came out this month. And if you read it, it's really remarkable how broad they are in that subject. And obviously, there's something about a subject benchmark statement that needs to be broad, right? Because you're talking about all these different courses that are run at different universities. But if you compare the one for politics and international relations with ones, I will say I've not read the one for physics, but other ones in the humanities and social sciences, the one for politics does seem really broad. And you're right, it's not always necessarily about building on kind of past knowledge. I remember on PG Cap, we had a session once on threshold concepts, and I was there with one of my colleagues from politics, and she was saying that, there's definitely threshold concepts in politics, and talking about some of them, and I said, I don't know what some of them are, so I don't think they are. So it can be a bit more nebulous, the study of politics, depending on the institution, but also really just depending on the person that's teaching and researching the field. So yeah, I think it can be hard to bring together kind of one idea of like how to communicate, how to teach in politics. It can be something you'll see time again is this claim, and I think it is in the subject benchmark statement that personal politics is, and so I think that could really impact the teaching and learning of this. Yeah,
because you talk on your very useful biography, which I genned up on before we came in, you talk about learning environment, which I thought was really interesting, because often when I think of teaching and learning, I think immediately of a relationship between two practitioners, a student and a facilitator. But I think the environment is key, actually. Yeah. And I think that's sort of our awareness of that has maybe changed as well post-COVID, that we've moved environments, we've seen how that's impacted teaching. So can you tell us a bit about that at York and what kind of issues you're seeing and what work you want to do there? It's
something that we've been really conscious of in the Department of Politics, that we want to have this learning community, right? Because we know, I mean, there's subtle literature on this that makes it really clear. If students feel that they are part of a community and participating in that community, but also just have the safety net of knowing it's there, they do better in their degrees. And so we were really keen to engender that feeling. And we started to really consciously think about this in, when would it have been? It was September 2019. So right before the pandemic took hold. And so it became a particularly trying time to really try and make that happen. But it's something that we still went for. And so, simple things like making sure we were visible on like the department's social media. So we took it from, I think it was something like 90 followers on our Instagram to well over 1,000 in a really short space of time, just to kind of show the department is active. So that it's just kind of in students' minds. They know the community is there. And yeah, we're kind of happy with the results of that. It is, I think you're right to say, the learning environment, the learning community is a really important part of the learning experience. And it's actually looking at the National Student Survey questions that have gone out this year. Formerly, there used to be 2 questions up until this year on learning community about whether students got the opportunity to work with others across their program and whether they felt part of a community of staff and students. And those questions are gone now, which I think is a real shame, because it does, I think, give real insight into the kind of feeling of a department, which can be really hard to pin down, right? If you're just popping through for an open day or a post-offer visit day, you can really get an impression, but that data I still think was really useful. And it's a shame that's gone, but nonetheless, it's something that I think is still really important. It'd be lovely to hear about. Do you have this kind of thing in physics as well?
I think it's, starting. I think we have an Instagram now, because the Department of Physics has merged with the engineering department. I think we have to sort of start again from scratch. But we have, I think, a page called Physics is Awesome on Instagram. I don't know much about it. So.
I should say the Instagram is obviously just one part of it that is kind of visible, and we've got we have a academic admin role that's learning community officer, someone that's charged with that as their administrative responsibility, and we've got a associate lecturer in the department who's doing that role now, John Evermy, who's come up with some great new ideas. He has a weekly coffee morning for students, so it's like in the politics reception, and it's actually really nice to see how many people come down to that. And again, not everyone coming in a department of well over 1,000 students. You'd run out of pastries very quickly. But just, I think it's a really lovely thing that students know it's there and know if they ever want to meet peers or kind of chat about current events, they know that that's there I think last time it was Wednesday, this time it's Tuesday. It's there.
Coming into that, because I am quite interested in how biographies feed into this kind of practice as well. And I was wondering how we felt as learners. Did we feel that we belonged, and whether any sense of belonging or misfit has informed any of your work? Or because actually a textbook or a kind of how-to guide I see as it's in a way an invitation to a community of practice as well, isn't it? It's making explicit kind of a method which maybe if you've already been around or encultured into that way of thinking is there for you, but it's not there for all of our learners. And actually I think recognizing that and kind of putting that kind of resource out there is one way of inviting them into a community of practice. So yeah, I was just wondering how your experiences as learners have informed your teaching or your thinking about teaching.
I think in a department like mine, the study of politics can seem, as I said, very personal, and that can very immediately mean party politics, which can be divisive, right? And my experience as an undergraduate student was that a lot of people that were on my course were very keen on party politics, and I was not so much interested in party politics as I was, which I'm still doing now, environmental politics, European Union level politics, and there wasn't kind of the niche group. There were the Labour students, the Conservative students, the Lib Dem students. And so I think in our department, we've been keen that the Politics Society, which is part of our department, is something that's not, Labour, Conservative, right or left, to use that old kind of Green Party phrase, not left, not right, but in front.
I haven't actually heard that.
So it's a good one, eh? So yeah, we're keen to make sure it's not a point of division, our interest in politics, which I hope's working.
I would have said, in my utter ignorance of both subjects, that when I think of politics, like politics being taught and physics being taught, I can see that politics would have much more sort of social curriculum underpinning it, with people kind of the exchange of ideas, having these crucibles of debate and things like that. I never thought of that with physics. I always kind of thought is that a valid component
I haven't either. to be fair. So when I was an undergrad, I would spend a lot of time. So we have these small weekly exams, and we had a group of 3 students that we would end up spending a lot of time with. And we would go to these small oral examinations and just answer questions by a teacher. And that really encouraged this idea that you should often, as much as possible, be working with somebody else, but not as a big group, because that's not necessary. Like, there's no... I don't think there is much debate in physics. Well, there is at a high level, of course, but as an undergrad, you're more like trying to grapple with a new language, really. And that language, it's useful to talk it with other people. So spending a lot of time with 2, 3 friends, people you like, and just discussing what you understand, trying to explain a perspective that you got, for example, that allows you to link 3 or 4 different topics, that is really useful. And having your friends being like, oh yeah, I understand that. That's a great idea. I don't see it like that though. And then they explain their things too. And that's a great way of learning.
In that, I'd say it's I'm seeing a kind of common thread with politics, right? Getting the opportunity to discuss these things and to make those links and with other people where you might not initially have made that leap and others can, and getting to discuss it, I think is really important. And probably any subject you get in here, they'll say much the same, right? That one of the really important things about the university level education is getting the opportunity to really discuss it and to pick things apart and to take kind of wild logical leaps that might go nowhere but could go somewhere really exciting.
So in the physics department, we have something that I find really useful is tutorials for the first year students. So we have the concept of pastoral supervision, which I think we have across all departments. So I end up having 20 supervisees, and 8 of them were first year students. And it was really useful to say, well, okay, so you 4 come in my office and we'll just talk about physics. And we did that every 2 weeks for the first term. And so the hope is to encourage these students to then keep working together. Now, I don't know how well that is working because of the randomness of here are 4 students, but maybe they don't click, right? So it's a good idea to try and make them work together. I don't know how to sort of systematize it and make sure that the people actually click and that they keep working together at the end of these tutorials. I know some students keep doing it, but not most of them.
When you experienced that it sounded like that happened quite organically. Like you did have that small group tutorial kind of support and you felt comfortable. Do you think that, are there questions there about how to make that work? Because you said, how do I make it work? Are there factors that are there that are not just about the bodies in there? Or because that sounds to me like an interesting kind of piece of work, actually, to look at how and whether small group work does work for learners now. And I guess if we're using that model, we should know that it should work, right? But I mean, that's kind of moving from the scholarly teaching to the scholarship of learning and teaching. It's just kind of, how do we know and what's going on there? When it looks good, what does it look like?
Well, it looks
5 questions in there. Sorry. Choose your favorite.
So it looks comfortable,
right?
And people are not afraid. So if you have a small group, people should not be afraid of sharing wild ideas or being really naive about things. Yes. But how do we, as a department or as individual lecturers, make this happen is a good question.
And do you talk about that with colleagues? Is there space to talk about that? Right.
I talk about it to students.
Maybe it's something we have a bit more departmental level discussion with, and it's something that with the semesterization and modularization process that I think might be going better in the future, right? Because we often find that students get into their seminar groups week 2, and occasionally someone misses a week because of illness or whatever. So by week 9, they've maybe had 8 sessions together, maybe, if they've all been there the whole time. And they're really getting to know each other and work together, and then the term's over, and by next term, they're going to be put into new groups because of timetabling issues. So stretching the term into a semester, hopefully is going to engender that feeling a little bit more of being in that small group consistently and taking a module fully through to the end together. So I'm hoping come September, we're actually going to see a kind of a lot better experience of this kind of small group teaching really paying dividends.
How do you guys both handle things like, presumably there's obviously in physics, let's say you got to get the principles of Newtonian physics and are parts of politics where you just got to say to the students, right, guys, this is just stuff that you've got to internalize. You need to absorb this. And before we get to the really juicy discussions and stuff like that, you need to sit down hitting the books. How do you get, what do you think is the best way of delivering that? So you got lectures which people seem to be wavering over. I think during COVID, they were just like, well, you know, why don't we just flip our lectures? And then lectures are now coming back and people see value to getting people in a room and doing a bit of chalk and talk. How do you guys deliver your content, and what's the balance of all these different modes?
I'm a big defender of the lecture as a format, and I've actually done some research in our department to get students' views on this, because as we were going through the modularization, semesterization process, there was the discussion of, you know, should we have recorded lectures online that we refresh occasionally, but put more time into our seminars? And the feedback we got from students in focus groups we ran in the department was 100% keep lectures, and with points that, you know, I didn't think about, the mental health benefits of getting together, even if you're not participating in conversation, but knowing you have peers around you to participate in that conversation is really useful. On the font of the conversation, I wanted to
it was. I mean, lectures was that was a big thing, because it came under a lot of fire with principles of flipped learning, and you had like, well, you know, people don't learn by just passively receiving stuff. I mean, I've been to some. I think all of us have been to some really useful lectures, and it would be, there is something there that's worth keeping. But
sorry, I've remembered your question now. Sorry, just escaped me quickly about, you know, the concepts you have to learn. And how you get that to stick. I think, again, this might be something that's common in physics, in that I teach a first year module called What is Politics? And a lot of it is, these are kind of the building blocks or kind of key concepts that you'd want to know. So something like Marxism, kind of a name everyone hears, and you want to know how to apply it. Feminism, elitism, principles of policymaking, like nudge. And some of it, you know, might be a bit dry at the beginning, but I do think case studies, you know, showing this is how it may or may not work in the real world, provides that hook that draws students in, and kind of making sure it's not just conceptual, and that you are providing cases that kind of spark interest, and asking students to go, this is one case. Are there any others that you're thinking of right now, and creating that hook? And I do think the addition of cases is often what can make, because you've got people in a room who will be conceptual, and you've got people that will be very practical, and you want to kind of bring both along for the ride. So I think you've got to kind of cater to both. But yeah, is this the same in physics?
There's about the lecture. I think there's no one way to lecture, right? You can do things in very different ways. And one of the things I've been trying with quite a lot of success in the master's level was to make a lecture that's actually also an exercise class. So I think the benefit of the lecture is you develop an argument, and they see you develop an argument over a thread of many lectures, and they see how it builds on each other, and that's great. But every time there was, well, not every time, but most of the time there was a small calculation that was doable, but that needed a bit of thinking, I'd just say, well, it's your turn now. And then I would just wait 4 or 5 minutes and walk across the room and
really
look at how the students are dealing with it. And that worked because there were 15 students in the class, right?
Okay.
So I tried to apply something similar in second year, where this time I asked simpler exercises, but it was about numerical values. I was teaching about planets, and I said, okay, can you calculate, for example, the density of this planet to tell me what it means for, is it a gas planet, is it a rocky planet, whatever. And that didn't work as well, because one student ended up giving the answer and all the others would wait. And I think the difference was the size of the class. I couldn't just walk and talk to the students what they were doing.
Yeah.
So next year I'm going to start teaching in first year, and then I'm going to have 200 students in front of me, and I'm still wondering how I can include that practice aspect. And the reason I care about the practice aspect is because I know that a lot of students come to the lectures and do not do anything else at home. And it's hard to encourage them to, and especially in the first year, they have many other things to deal with. Like, it's the first time they live on their own, so they have to, plan their budget, cook their own food, and etc. And they don't want to work at home. So I'm just trying to make sure that for those who don't, they still have the minimum education that they need, and practice is a fundamental aspect of that. Feedback is the fundamental aspect of that. And I found that feedback, maybe you don't necessarily need to wait until, they have done an exam and you give them feedback. Maybe you can just tell them, okay, try this out, then wait, and then give the answer. That's one form of feedback that's fairly cheap, but important for the students. So that's what I'm thinking about. How do you make this work when you have so many students that it's impossible to give them your attention individually?
It's tricky, yeah.
That's sorry.
I was just going to say, it's funny how kind of different maybe our fields are. Because when you said I do a lecture and exercise class, I 100% thought you were talking about yoga or something.
He's telling star jumps. Really works.
You're really bringing a lot of energy to the learning experience here. It might work, to be honest. Help with engagement.
There's a book about that called Spark, which is fascinating, actually, where the students, so in a high school, they decided that all the students need to have PE just before philosophy or whatever, and they have shown that the grades do improve because of whatever chemicals are released.
If we're really going to stretch that, it is something about stimulation of students in what has traditionally been perceived as a passive kind of space for knowledge transmission. And what you're saying is interesting. You're bringing in little bits of the tutorial, the more active learning. You've got those two sort of extremes of, is it 3 people in a room sitting together or is it 200 in a lecture theatre? But what's interesting and common is the kind of social exchange that's happening there, whether it's you and a learner or whether it's learner to learner, which I think is an interesting dynamic which we often forget about in a lecture space. But Jeremy, I think you're right. Students go there because there are conversations that happen around the content that we think we're transmitting, which arguably are just as valuable. It's a kind of incidental learning stuff. But something I think is really interesting is what staff and practitioners think a lecture is versus or compared to what students think a lecture is, and how explicit we are about those expectations as well. And is that something you talk about with learners? Do they get sort of... Yeah.
It's something I try and communicate, at least what my intention is. So it kind of frames it for them that in my mind, a lecture is the kicking off point. I introduce the subject and then I've given readings. They read to kind of take the next step and then they discuss that in the seminars. That's the kind of framework in my mind. Now, there's 2 things that can run up against. One is timetabling, that sometimes you can have a lecture Monday and you think, okay, great, the students have the seminar on Wednesday, easy peasy, but they might have a bunch of other sessions between then and a bunch of other reading they'll have to do. So that might not work for them, but also just learning styles. Maybe some people really like to read beforehand and use the lecture as the kind of confirmation point where everything falls into place, hopefully, if it's delivered well. And then they discuss it in the seminar. But at least I kind of share that framing of how I'm using it.
So in the politics department, you have 1 lecture, 1 seminar, 1 lecture, 1 seminar?
Exactly. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
What do you do in physics?
Many lectures.
Okay.
A few seminars.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
So maybe 1 seminar for 9 lectures, something like this.
Wow, that's very alien.
Which is why I try to really force the practice into the lecture. Otherwise, I'm afraid that for a lot of students, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's
If you had your free reign, what would it look like?
Half.
Right.
Yeah. I'm kind of really surprised. Yeah, I can't imagine teaching that way at all. Yeah.
I was expecting kind of physics to be a bit more information transmission based, but the way you described it was not. I mean, I think that's a pretty interactive lecture. So you're going around making sure students are on task, breaking it up with activities, and I think I was comparing it to. I know Yale put all their lectures up on for free, so I just thought I'm just going to see what a Yale lecture looks like and watch one on critical theory. I don't know why, but so this was hardcore chalk and talk, which was literally guy holding Professor Paul Fry of I still remember that, and he was the guru, and he would stand there, and it was very much sage on the stage, and he delivered a performance, around, and he would talk through these ideas. Didn't actually use the chalk. He just sort of held it.
It's very good to have that thing in hand to wave. Yeah.
But I mean, the students were getting loads out of it. I mean, they were sort of, he was making these critical theory jokes and they were laughing in the right places. They were clearly, which I did get. So, but it was an effective way of, I mean, it seemed to be an effective way of teaching, but, and I wondered how utilized that format is now, but it's interesting to hear that you've got in physics, which you kind of think as being a bit more like information transmission, that you're still so important to get in that interleaved learning. We've got to break things up with practice. You've got to get the recall in there. You need to get opportunities for just spaces and like breathing space between delivery of sections and everything.
Well, I suppose one of the things that you don't necessarily realize when you don't do physics, that the content is very, very small, actually.
Right.
There is not much information to transmit. So I remember at the end of my undergrad, I sat down and I took a piece of paper and I was like, okay, so I think I can derive thermodynamics and fluid dynamics from Newtonian mechanics. And I think I can show that, so some of things are conserved, like the energy is conserved, the momentum is conserved. I can show that from Newton. And then I know other things are conserved, like mass and charge. And then conservation leads me to understanding transport of, for example, how fast perfume is going through a room, or how fast neutrons are moving in a nuclear plant, or how fast heat is transported through a wall or whatever. And then the third thing is Maxwell equations. And then I realized, well, that's it. That's 2 years of learning, and I can write it on a piece of paper, and that's all, right? So the point of the lectures is to make the students discover that for themselves, if you will. And the way to do this is to show, well, okay, here's what matters, and here's how you understand it, and now let's apply it again and again and again and again and again. So practice is very important, and the information is very small. There's a small amount. So that's why I'm a bit wary of the sort of lecture where you just show things and don't make the students practice, because then what they do is they see you practice over and over again, which I think is not enough.
Do you get nervous around silences? Because I noticed you said you said something when you were talking about going around and giving them the tasks. And is that something that features in either of your? Are you happy to sit back and let them?
What would that be about? Is it? You don't mean discomfort with just a silence in a room, or more about wondering about whether learning's happening? Or?
Well, wondering whether learning's happening. But I get this thing so I'm teaching a language as a qualitative subject and everything, and I get this thing where I want to give them thinking time, and I know for a fact that I'm biased against like setting a question and having some crashing silence and not knowing whether they're thinking about it or if it needs some intervention, or they've even been listening to anything that I've said. So I feel like this cultural impulse to fill the silence. And like sometimes I certainly think that I'm kind of letting that lead me. And what you do need to do is step back and let them, like you say, do tasks and figure things out for themselves. But in a lecture where you've got an hour or 2 hours and you're very time bound, do you ever feel any pressure to sort of jump in and answer for them or chivvy them along, or are you happy with just stepping back?
100%. I jump in. Yeah, a silence can be awkward, and maybe this is something I should an impulse I should fight and kind of let that awkwardness ride out. But in a lecture, if I ask a question and silence reigns, I'll answer it. I won't leave that hanging, because often I want to move on anyway. Like there's something I want to get to. I've used it as a kind of rhetorical point. But I definitely, when I first started doing seminars, I couldn't stand the silence, of letting a question linger. And so I would really kind of drive the conversation along. But as I go on, I'm kind of getting more jaded or just like more happy to kind of let that happen and see what it produces. But I wouldn't say it's kind of radically improved my teaching practice, letting those silences ride. I do wonder if kind of, at least for me, really trying to enthuse people and kind of get them involved in a kind of consistent conversation has been a bit more fruitful overall.
I think, Lucy, you asked the right question about silence. Is like, what does it mean? Are they thinking, or are they wondering what the hell is happening? Should I do something? So it's a really difficult one. So in that small class I teach in master's levels, not too hard, because I can walk and talk to individuals and see if they're writing. So silence reigns for most of the class, but I don't have to feel the pressure, because in my little bubble, there's no silence. I'm always talking to someone. one of the things I do is because it's exercises that I like to give them and not jumping jacks, right? Physics exercises. I give progressive hints also, because what I'm always worried about is to make the exercise too easy for some people and too hard for some others. So the way I try and deal with that is I ask an exercise that's fairly open, then I wait a bit and go talk to people, and then I add one hint that makes it a bit easier, and then a second hint. And that allows me to also break up the silence, if you will, fairly often. Now, because we also have, now Mentimeter and that sort of things, one thing you can do also is just put a slide on the board and ask, okay, well, here's a question. And then there is silence, but there's also answers coming in and words coming in that you can comment on. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily silence, but there's still space for the students to think, which I think is good. But
I just come in because it strikes me this is the longest conversation I've had about teaching ever.
I was going to say, you guys are right for time. We're on 40 minutes at the moment.
And I'm really keen at just we move on to one final bit, because as ever, there's not like that much time.
Of course.
I just think it's so interesting that in terms of, we've probably collectively spent a huge amount of our academic lives teaching.
Yeah.
And for me, and I'm in a teaching support role, I've been moving from a research role to a learning and teaching role over the last 10 years. And this is still the longest conversation I've ever had about teaching, which I think is connected to the environment we're in and the value that's placed on teaching. And I kind of wanted us to move to, what are the particular challenges of maybe looking at teaching in a scholarly way and then moving towards sharing that with a kind of teaching commons in a research intensive, because I think that's a big part of where that comes from. So, everyone here is so reflective about their practice. People really care about students and learning. Where is that going? Mm-hmm. And how do you think, what are some of the issues there? How are you going to get this out of this room, basically? No pressure.
Podcast is one good idea.
Okay, so we've actually made some space for it, which is
I would agree. I think
great.
This is a fantastic thing.
Yeah.
I'd also, I do feel quite lucky in the politics department that we do take teaching really seriously. And we have long conversations about teaching practice there, which I think are fundamentally important to the provision that we have there. And do shape what we do in a really important way. We also have funding support for scholarship in our department, which may happen in other departments. I'm slightly ignorant of that, but I've done quite a few projects now funded by the Scholarship and Learning Environment Fund, which, have impacted on what we do around modularization, semesterization, things like continuing the lecture. So they can, the scholarship we do can impact at a departmental level. But certainly, I think we should be working on external engagement as well, because I do genuinely think that the work we do here at York is of a pretty good standard and could be shared with other universities. And I feel you said you published a bit on this.
Yeah, I mean, one of my questions is going to be about, I guess, dissemination. And I think sort of by definition, almost, if you're involved in teaching, if you're on a teaching scholarship contract, you're both ideally placed to do a bit of scholarship and teaching research, but also very difficult to find the time and to work it into a schedule. So first open question to both of you about do you have any plans for dissemination and how do you work that into your already packed schedule?
I'll say today I've taken a break. I'm about to submit a article to the Journal of Political Science Education. So hopefully later today we'll be sending something off for that. So fingers crossed.
Well, I feel perhaps to come back on one of the barriers into why this is not happening is just the academia as a culture is very individualistic. Mm-hmm. So if you have good ideas, you're almost tempted to keep them to yourself, because then you can have good student feedback. And so, I mean, it's not what we want to do, but that's what the incentives are right now. So that's difficult. Publishing about what you do is one way around this, because even though you're sharing, it's still good for you, right, to do it. What I'm hopeful will happen in the next few years, because right now I think we're in survival mode, so that's a big problem. We need to make mods and sems right, which takes a lot of time. But maybe in a couple of years, hopefully we'll have more space to think about how to share. And one of the things that Phil Lightfoot, Phil Lightfoot in the physics department, the head of teaching, wants to do is to have a working group for all the TNS across physics and engineering, so that we can share ideas and try and make something happen, either as research or just workshops where you can just share what has worked, what hasn't. Yep.
So it's about that recognition of the value of what's happening, as well as sharing, and obviously wanting to do that for good practice and for learners, but actually to have it institutionally kind of acknowledged. And sounds like some departments have got those structures in place, or at least the start of them, and there's will to do it. But I think you're right, there's always a crisis that's sort of getting in the way of that at the moment. But
something else that's helping it, though, is there is a clear career progression now at York on the TNS pathway, right? So we've got our first senior lecturer TNS in the politics department now, and knowing that there's professor in TNS, it shows that there's that pathway, and so it does incentivize people to produce that scholarship and to disseminate it to good journals. So I think certainly we're going to see a lot more of this in coming years.
I hope so. There's central recognition of that as well, even though it's sort of relatively limited, the resource. We're looking at creating a kind of drop-in module for staff who are interested in developing a scholarship strand. So that would be right from, I'm doing some reflective practice on my teaching, to I want to go public with this in whatever form, whether that's sharing it at a learning and teaching forum or actually publishing in peer review. So I think it's coming, but it's still sort of, in a way, it's quite a nice time to be part of it, because you get input there, and it's, you get to have conversations like these. But I think there has been a real sea change in terms of teaching and discussions about teaching across the sector. I don't think we've quite caught up with the structures around that yet, but it's not a kind of side thought anymore. And that's for various different reasons, some of them kind of more or less problematic, I think. But, I think that sort of going public about teaching, sharing about teaching, there's definitely more of a culture of support for that. So, yeah. Thank you.
I think the UK and York in particular is doing amazingly well. In France, there is no recognition for teaching, zero at all. And I think so we're on the right path, right?
Yeah.
But now all the recognition you've just talked about is promotion and career advancement. So that's still individual. I feel like perhaps one day we'll have ways to recognize group success also. And that would fundamentally improve exchanging.
And that would change the culture around, actually, this is a commons, rather than this is an individual practice, which is the problem, isn't it? It's the problem with the ref culture, that actually what we don't want to do with scholarship is bleed into that, or take on all of that as a kind of structure. I think one of the things I find really attractive about scholarship, and I had a research career as well, is that this does feel more communal. It's about relationships in classrooms, and I think that does something fundamental to the sort of starting point in terms of reference.
Yeah.
So yeah, fingers crossed for that.
We'll see how it goes. I think individual scholarship still has a place, but it shouldn't be the only way.
Yeah.
Brilliant, guys. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. This has been really nice, and we'll hopefully do it again sometime.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.